In episode 39, Is This a Reference with Sylvia Sierra? I mentioned that I have in my possession a t shirt that contains some fairly bespoke ex-Mormon references. I'm wearing it now. It says, Any opposed may now manifest it. And it's got a strange character on it. Who is this character and what relation does it have with the words? I promised I would explain it, and now I'm going to. The first thing we need to explain is the Mormon principle of common consent. LDS scriptures say that all things must be done by common consent in the church. And this usually takes the form of members voting on changes in church policy or on leadership appointments. Well, not exactly voting. Once the decision is made, then that decision is put before the different congregations, and members are asked to sustain or oppose by raising their hand. Strange little custom. And I say it's strange because it's always unanimous. The bishop or the local leader will ask for a sustaining vote for this or that person. And strangely, everybody always raises their hand to sustain or approve. And then the bishop says, Any opposed may now so manifest. And no one ever raises their hand to oppose. In all my 38 years of being in Mormon congregations, I never saw anyone oppose once. So Latter-day Saints will be very familiar with this ritual and the wording in it. Now that explains the text on the shirt. But who is this mysterious figure sitting on the chair? And why does he have a rather prominent doinger? Well, to understand, we need to go back to 1835. Joseph Smith formed the LDS Church in 1830, and he initially had a hit with the Book of Mormon. Smith claimed that it was the ancient record of Hebrew people who sailed on boats to the Americas and became the ancestors of the Native Americans. He claimed to have translated the Book of Mormon from ancient records in a language called Reformed Egyptian, with help from God and a rock in a hat. That's right, he had a rock that he would stick in a hat and put his face in the hat and claim that the rock was showing him the words that his scribe should write. And that became the Book of Mormon. Now, for many, the Book of Mormon was proof that God still spoke to humans and that Joseph Smith was a real prophet, just like Moses. Naturally, this is all a bit crazy. You can't translate books using magic rocks. But when you are the leader of a congregation of crazy people, any other crazy person can swoop in and poach your credulous congregation, put them in their congregation. And so, from the beginning, Joseph Smith faced challenges to his authority and to his leadership by people who claimed to have the same prophetic spirit that he had. So, the way that he responded to these challenges was to produce more material. At various times, he would come up with more stuff as a way of showing that he was the real deal and the others weren't. So, for example, in 1832, he claimed that back in the 1820s, when he was 14 years old, he'd seen a vision of God. That was when he believed that God and Jesus were the same person. By 1838, when he believed that God and Jesus were two people, he changed his story to say that he'd seen it was actually God and Jesus. By the way, he never mentioned this vision at the time. No one in the early days of the church had ever heard of this first vision. It was a retcon that he came up with to show that he was a prophet. When he faced more challenges to his leadership in 1835, he bolstered his authority by claiming that years earlier, John the Baptist and the apostles Peter, James, and John had visited him and given him the priesthood, the authority to administrate the church and do God's stuff. He never mentioned it at the time, but by 1835, it's like this was something that he needed to establish his primacy in the church. Now, this worked for quite a while, but pretty soon Joseph was in need of some new material. He had to have another hit. So, in 1835, someone named Michael Chandler was touring the country, the USA, with some Egyptian mummies. And when Chandler stopped in Kirtland, Ohio, where most of the church members were living, Joseph Smith saw the papyri and said, Aha! These were written by none other than Abraham of the Old Testament. What were the odds? His own account of his life, written by his own hand, would come down to us through the ages by a traveling Egyptian show. Wow, what a world. So the church bought the papyri, and starting in 1835 and finishing in 1842, he worked them into what's now known as the Book of Abraham. Now, this was at a time when Joseph Smith's theology was getting pretty out there. All the weird Mormon stuff like man becoming as a god, getting your own planet, multiple eternal wives, God living near a planet or a star called Kolob? That was all from this time. As well, Joseph Smith was absorbing as much Hebrew as he could from the scholars that he met, and he was happy to blend in Hebrew into his sermons. So this was him at his most speculative, and Egyptian got wrapped into all of that because, of course, everything's a remix. Now, wrapping in Egyptian was a pretty safe move for Joseph Smith because, although Jean-Francois Champollion had completed his decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics in 1822, knowledge of this discovery was not widely known or understood by regular people in America. So Joseph Smith fabricated the Book of Abraham, guessing that no one would call him out on any claims that he'd made about the papyri. There came a problem. While it was thought that the papyri were destroyed in a fire, turned out they were very much in existence. In the 1960s, they were discovered and examined. They turned out to be nothing more than common Egyptian funerary documents, the kind that were frequently included in the tombs of people who had died. Mormons today, while they concede that the parchment was not in fact written by Abraham, they nevertheless try to claim that Joseph Smith used them as some kind of divine catalyst to receive revelation from God. But that's not what Joseph Smith claimed. He claimed that it was actually written by the hand of Abraham himself. And what's especially damning about these papyri, and the reason we know that they're wrong, is that Smith also attempted to give information about some of the drawings that were made. I've got a copy of one of these facsimiles right here. I'll flash it up on screen. It's in my quad, the one that I carried around for 2 years as a Mormon missionary. So this is facsimile 2 from the LDS scripture known as the Pearl of Great Price. It's a round thing, and we know today that this is a hypocephalus, which means it was placed under the head of the deceased person. Now, Joseph Smith made a number of claims about the figures represented on this drawing, all of which turned out to be wrong. And this has proved to be a deal breaker for lots of Mormons today. Let's take a look. Number one, Kolob, signifying the first creation. Number two, stands next to Kolob, called by the Egyptians Oliblish. Figure three, made to represent God sitting on his throne. And so on and so on. Lots of junk here. Number six represents this earth in its 4 quarters, and it doesn't. These are the Egyptian gods. And there are lots more. But number 7, this guy from my t-shirt. Smith's interpretation of this was represents God sitting on his throne, revealing through the heavens the grand keywords of the priesthood, etc., etc. So this figure was supposed to be God sitting on his throne with a visible erection. I don't know if Smith noticed the erection, but of course, this is not the Christian God sitting on his throne. Modern Egyptologists will recognize this right off as the Egyptian god Min, an ithyphallic deity. Ithyphallic means having an erect penis. You see, Min was a god of fertility and harvest and was always depicted with a hard-on and a flail, because sometimes you just need to have a flail. The important thing is he's discernibly turgid, as befits the penis god. So this t-shirt combines those 2 pieces of information. First up, that Min is semi-erect and raising his dong, much in the same way as a Latter-day Saint would raise their hand to approve the appointment of some leader. And then, having raised his member, the text says, any opposed may now manifest. By the way, did anybody in the LDS church realize at the time that there was a penis in plain view right there in the Mormon scriptures, whether it belonged to Jehovah or anyone else for that matter? Well, they must have, because Min's boner mysteriously disappeared in the 1902 edition of the Pearl of Great Price. Perhaps it was removed forcibly, or perhaps it simply returned to its flaccid condition. 1921 edition, still gone. But fortunately, Min's manhood was restored in the 1981 edition, ready for round 2, I suppose. And in the 2013 edition, still there. If it lasts longer than 34 years, consult a doctor. Whether they realized it was Min or Jehovah or anyone else, they certainly didn't want a dong in their scriptures. And there you have it. That's 2 bespoke pieces of Mormon knowledge as well as some Egyptology coming together in a meme that I think is rather funny.